everyone, Gabe here from HomeStudioEngineer.com and ToastedBananas.com, and today I wanted to give you my top 5 basic drum mixing tips. I love mixing drums. I love getting the big fat SSL style, smacking rock drums, and I like that almost to a fault. Sometimes I'll be mixing a song and I realize the drums are just way too much for what the song is sometimes, but whatever the drum sound that you're after is, these tips should help you find new ways to shape that sound, hopefully shape it more efficiently, make it a little more interesting. Before we get started, as always, I want to give you a free gift. I've written a guide called The 5 Steps to Professional Recordings in Your Home Studio with the gear you already have. And it's a step-by-step guide showing you how to get professional sounding recordings with the gear you have. Doesn't talk about buying anything or anything like that. It's free, so just check it out. There's a link in the description where you can download it, keep it as a reference guide, and let me know what you think. Now let's not waste any time. Let's just jump right into the tips. And tip number 1 is layering in samples with live drums. And we're starting a little bit controversial because people have some strong opinions on whether or not it's okay to use drum samples, at least in things like rock and metal, things like that. It's not as big of a deal in pop music, singer-songwriter stuff, but there are a lot of rock guys, and maybe you're one of them that doesn't really believe in using samples. They want to use live drums. And I can totally understand that. I prefer the sound of live drums versus samples, but the reality is that using samples with live drums is an industry standard, and it has been for a long time in pretty much every genre of music. And it's particularly helpful when you're working in a home studio environment and you don't have access to an amazing drum room. You're just working with what you've got. Layering in samples can get you bigger drums, and it gives you a lot more control over shaping your drum sound. Now, there are a few different ways that you can go about this. If you wanted to do drum replacement, meaning you just want to replace the drums that you recorded with samples that sound better, you could use something like the Steven Slate Trigger 2 plugin, which is really simple to use. You put it on the track. There's an entire library of samples to browse through, and you can add your own. And you set up, the sensitivity, and it makes it really simple. Now, if you want to use your live drums along with samples, which is what I recommend, the easiest thing to do if you're going to use a plugin like this is to just duplicate each one of your drum tracks and put this plugin or whatever you have that's similar to it, whatever trigger plugin you like, on those duplicated tracks and set it up that way. But a lot of times what I do is just go in and do it manually, which, yes, it is a tedious, sometimes time-consuming and boring process, but the results are well worth it. And I want to demonstrate the benefit of using samples with live drums for you right now. I'm going to play a section of just the drum mix, and we're going to hear just the live drums right now. And there's been no processing done on any of these drum tracks. They're all just as they were recorded. The only thing I've done is, kind of balance the volume and done a little bit of panning. And the only processing that you're going to hear is there's a little bit of EQ and a little bit of compression on the mix bus. Let's take a listen to what the live drums sound like. Pretty straightforward, nothing spectacular, but it doesn't sound bad. But let's go ahead and add in the samples, and we're using a handful of kick samples and snare samples. Those are the only samples we're using, but listen to the difference that it makes to the overall drum sound. So that's quite a big difference. So let's listen to that again. I'll take the samples off and just play the live drums, and we'll compare one more time. So there you have it. Don't be afraid to use samples along with live drums. In this case, and it's usually the case with me, I try to leverage more of the live drum sound. I like that to be my foundation, and I kind of tuck the samples in underneath just to support the live drums. I want to get something from the samples that the live drums don't offer me. That just helps keep the kit sounding more natural, but if you've got great sounding samples, it shouldn't be a problem even if you're only using samples. Alright, so tip number 2 is using parallel compression, and I recently did a video all about parallel compression, so if you haven't seen it, I'll put a link in the description, so check that out. I recommend it. But if you don't know what parallel compression is, the short of it is that you blend a lightly compressed or an uncompressed track with a really aggressively compressed copy of that track. And this happens to sound great on drums, particularly if you're working in dense mixes, dense rock mixes, dense pop mixes. Works well. The way I like to do it is to just duplicate my drum bus. So I'll select my drum bus, select Shift Option D in Pro Tools, and make a duplicate. Now I can do whatever processing I want on this and sort of blend it in with my normal drum bus, with my normal drum tracks. But you're not just limited to doing it on the bus. You could do this on, your kick sub or your snare sub or your tom sub. You could do it on everything if you want. But it's a really useful tool. Again, I recommend checking out my parallel compression video so you can see more about how that works. But definitely try it on drums. So tip number 3 is take advantage of panning. Another way to enhance your drum mix is to use panning to make the drums sound more interesting. And there are a few different philosophies on how to do this, and I encourage you to experiment. But generally, folks tend to favor drummer perspective or audience perspective. And all that really means is that you pan the drums similar to how they would be set up while the drummer is playing. Which way you pan depends on whether you want to do it from the drummer's perspective or the audience perspective. Now, one is not better than the other. Both work fantastically, and I encourage you to do whichever one makes more sense in your head. That'll be easier. That's what I do. I tend to do drummer perspective, so my panning typically goes something like this. I usually have the kick and snare right down the middle. I want that to be consistent in both speakers. I want that to occupy the center of the track and be there as a solid foundation. My hi-hat is generally panned somewhere around 30 to the left, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. If I have one rack tom, it's usually 20 to the left. If I have two of them, one goes, approximately 20 to the left, and the other goes approximately 20 to the right. And then the floor tom goes somewhere around 60 to the right. And those numbers are not the gold standard, and I even change them up from song to song. So just go with what feels right. Let's actually look and see what I did for the panning on this mix. You see, I've got the kicks and snares mono, of course. See, I've got the floor tom at 70, which is a little bit further than where I normally have it. The rack tom's at 24 to the left, and the hi-hat is at 30 to the left. So toms is a good example. With the toms, I like to hear and feel the movement of like a tom roll or a tom fill, and sometimes I'll make those pans a little more extreme. But just experiment and go with what works for you and works for your track, because it's different from song to song. Alright, so tip number 4 is don't be afraid of reverb. Reverb on drums can be a really nice touch that enhances your overall drum sound. You're probably familiar with putting reverb on the snare, which sounds amazing, but you can also put a little bit of reverb on your kick, which to me sounded crazy at first, but I've been doing it ever since, and it's just a small amount, but it can really elevate your drum mix a bit. But whether you're putting your reverb on your kick or snare or toms or whatever, I recommend using a send rather than putting it on a track. So for instance, in Pro Tools, rather than going and putting the reverb on this kick track, I would rather send from it. So route out to a new track and then put the reverb on this aux track that we're going to create. But another thing that I recommend doing is if you are working with samples and live drums, I recommend using the sample to trigger the reverb. So samples tend to be more consistent. You're kind of getting the same velocity or a controlled amount of velocity on each hit. So when that triggers the reverb, you're going to get a much more consistent reverb as well. And here's where I recommend another step. Another popular trick is to use the so-called Abbey Road trick. And this is where you actually put an EQ before the reverb, and you roll off the highs and lows. That can really clean up any harshness or unwanted bass frequencies in the reverb and give you a little more control. Otherwise, you just want to add the reverb to taste. So just as an example, let's put we'll just put a stock reverb up there, and then right before it, we'll use this stock Avid EQ. So what I would do in this case is I would put the high pass filter and the low pass filter on, just kind of roll it off, kind of like this. That would probably be my starting point. Then I could tweak from there. In some cases, I might boost a little bit in mid-range. Just kind of depends on what your song needs. Experiment with this too, and you can find that you can really start to shape your reverb sounds. Tip number 5 is to use automation to make the mix more exciting. Automation is often really underused. Strategic fader rides through a song can really make the track much more interesting. Even just riding the fader of, the snare sub in the chorus can go a really long way to elevating the song. It'll certainly elevate the chorus in a lot of cases. Always look for ways to create more energy in your mix using automation. It's a really fun area to experiment with, and the reality is, if you and some other person mix the song and you both mix it the exact same way, except that you do some fader rides on the snare hits in the chorus, or you bring out the kick more in certain sections, 9 times out of 10, people are going to prefer your mix over the other guys because you added those tiny details. Mixing is about the details at the end of the day. That's what's going to separate a good mix from a great mix. So take the time to go in here and do a little bit of automation. It doesn't have to be anything over the top or anything like that. One thing that you can do that's really simple is just go to your chorus and go on your snare sub and just select the range of the chorus and then bump that up, a dB or so, maybe a dB and a half, just depends on what the song is. And that's a really easy way to just add more energy to your track. Things like energy and excitement in your track can really be delivered most consistently by using automation. We can get it from compressors and effects and things like that, but taking the time to go in with automation and kind of draw out the little details will really take your drum mixes to the next level. So those were my top 5 basic drum mixing tips. I hope you found them useful. If you have any questions at all about any of the tips that we covered, or if you would like to see more in-depth videos on how to do some of those, please let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, please be sure to download the 5 Steps to Professional Recordings in your home studio. There's a link in the description. Please like and subscribe if this video helped you out. That'll help me out a ton. Links to all my social media and all kinds of other stuff are down there, so please check that out. But with that, thank you all so much for watching, and take care.